Someone Like You by Sparkypasker. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 19. Izuku sat in his new apartment, just staring at his new uniform. Hatsume had delivered it by drone just a few hours after he moved in. Other than his book bag and the small pile of blankets borrowed from Uraraka, this reinforced container was the only thing he had to move into his unit. At first he was concerned about it being so conspicuous, but he soon realized there was almost no one out and about during the day. He stood, taking his uniform out of its case and putting it on. It fit just as well as it did when he tried it on in Hatsume's office. Izuku ran his hands down his sides, marveling at the feel of the micro-laced Kevlar. He put on his, now well-worn and broken-in, shoes, strapped his mask over his face, then pulled the hood of his bodysuit up over his head. Lastly, he took one last item out of the case. It was his visor. He had been communicating back and forth with Hatsume for weeks, making sure his operating system was installed and working correctly. It took a bit of time to make the program compatible with a mobile device rather than a computer, but he made it work. He positioned the visor over his eyes and felt the magnets activate, locking his face mask, visor, and hood together into one unit. Theoretically, the magnetism should be strong enough to stop anything from being knocked loose, but in the event something does, it should strengthen the hold on whatever parts of the uniform remain. Like if he loses his visor, the hood and mask will bind together stronger. It's a safeguard he built in to protect his identity. Izuku knows that most heroes don't bother putting in a lot of effort into doing the same, but they aren't Izuku. If someone finds out it was Izuku, the quirkless freak, that arrested them, they would, without a doubt, track him down. Then everyone who he ever talked to would be in danger. Not to say the same thing doesn't happen to heroes, because he is sure it does. It's just that, as a hero, they wouldn't be underestimated. Underestimation is good for Izuku when he is patrolling, but not when he is a civilian. No one would think twice about attacking him. Most would at least reconsider an attack on a hero. As such, he needed to make sure he never revealed his identity to anyone while he was in uniform. He had his identification number to give to dispatchers, but he didn't really have a name to give to anyone else he met. He had been thinking about it a lot, but there was really only one he could think of that he felt was right. It felt natural. Absent. Although unofficial, that was going to be what he called himself. If anyone found out he was quirkless, they would probably believe it was a play on that, but it wasn't really it. It was more like an anti-prophecy. Whenever he needed help, there was never anyone around to help him. But if he could help it, he would never let anyone else feel that way. It was his constant reminder. Izuku took a deep breath. He couldn't be his normal self during patrols. He had to get rid of his second-guessing and uncertainty. He wasn't sure he could, but he didn't have a choice. If he let his anxieties take over, either himself or a civilian could be killed. He could not allow that to happen. Izuku stood in front of his kitchen window. He was met with a subpar view. Just a dark alley. The surrounding buildings even blocked the moon from shining down. He opened it, then jumped out. In all reality, he probably could not have picked a better building to live in. The environment made for a perfect place to suddenly appear and disappear. His gray and black palette camouflage allowed him to blend into the darkness as he walked from the alley and into the street. Izuku walked a few blocks, then entered another empty alley. This one was quite a bit smaller, only about 4 feet wide. He didn't understand why alleys were made this small. They were too small to put fire escapes in, but they were the perfect size for Izuku to spider crawl up. He put each hand on a wall, then one foot, then the other. He put pressure on his hands, then used his abdominals to plant his feet further up the wall. Next, he put pressure on his feet, lifting himself up higher. and planted his hands on the walls once more. He repeated this until he was at the roof. He gripped the edge of the roof with one hand, then used the opposite foot to push off the wall, and grabbed onto the ledge with both hands. Then all he had to do was pull himself up. Izuku ran, leaping from rooftop to rooftop until he saw a group of men smoking in an alley. "Hey, I heard you got a new job," said a tall man with tanned skin. He had soiled bandages wrapped around his head and a majority of his torso, so the words he spoke came out slightly muffled. "Yeah, and it's paying real well, too. My family and I might actually be able to live comfortably for a few months. We won't have to go dumpster diving or water down our miso soup so that it lasts more than one meal," a smaller man with gray hair answered. "That sounds like the life," a large man with 4 arms signed wistfully, blowing smoke into the air. "Unfortunately, looking like I do, this bar security job is the only one I could find." "You're telling me," gray-haired responded. "I make oxygen. I'm as useful as a houseplant. I may as well be quirkless for all that gets me." The men were quiet for a moment. "Say, what kind of job is it?" Mummy Man asked. "Some sort of janitor job?" Gray Hair said uncertainly. The recruiter said there was this site that needed to be cleaned up and it needed to be done quickly, so their boss was authorizing them to find as many people as possible and to pay a shitload of cash to make it happen. And they don't give a crap about quirks. Straight from the recruiter's mouth. "Damn," Forearm said with emphasis. "Do you happen to know if they're still looking for workers? I would love to get out of this place for a while. Maybe actually pay back some of those debts I owe." "I'm not sure, but I still have the recruiter's number. I will call them and find out." "If they are, hook me up too," Mummy Man said. Gray Hair laughed. "Will do." The 3 men then stomped out their cigarettes and walked back into the building, presumably going back to work. Izuku stayed there for a moment, making sure no one came back out and would see him moving about. He had been told that Southern Mustafa was crime-ridden, but he wasn't really seeing any of that. In fact, the only thing he had seen so far was some people who were down on their luck trying to make a living. But Izuku thought Southern Mustafa was a large area. There is no way he could be in all places at once. It's likely crime is happening all over, just not where he was at that moment. He wondered if there was a way to predict where crime would happen before it actually did. Almost everything in life had a pattern. If he studied the crime habits of the area and found the pattern, he could probably do a lot more good rather than just wandering around aimlessly. After a few more hours of patrolling, where he didn't do much more than make sure some people who were out walking alone made it to where they were going, Izuku went home. He looked up at his kitchen window on the second floor and wondered how he should get back up. There was no fire escape, and he couldn't just jump nearly 10 feet. A light bulb went off. He remembered seeing a video where, when he was studying parkour, about someone damn near running up the side of a wall, then jumping across to another wall across from it. Izuku had never tried to do that before, but it couldn't hurt to try. Izuku backed up toward the entrance to the alley, then ran at full speed toward the wall opposite his window. The soles of his shoes gripped the wall, allowing him to run up it with a little problem. Pushing off the wall with both feet, Izuku soared toward his still open kitchen window. He grabbed the sill with the tips of his fingers and cushioned his impact by making sure both of his feet landed on the building. Then all he had to do was crawl through his window, and he was home. It wasn't the best way to get in because it actually made quite a bit of noise, but it would work in an emergency. The next time he went out, he would see if it was any easier to jump from the higher building next door. His shoes absorbed impacts, so as long as he made sure to land on his apartment, no one should hear him on the roof. Izuku removed his uniform and returned it to its case. then took a shower to remove any sweat he accumulated. He laid out a couple blankets as a makeshift futon and crawled underneath a third, slightly heavier blanket. He didn't have to work at the cafe the next day, so he would use that time to find the crime pattern. With the plan in mind, Izuku went to sleep. Chapter 20. It turned out there absolutely was a pattern. If the area was split into 12 sections in a circle like a compass, the different sectors experienced crime in a clockwise pattern. Sector 1 would have crimes one day and Sector 2 the next. But there were exceptions that made it feel more random. Every third day, 2 to 3 sectors would be skipped. Whether it was 2 or 3 depended on if the day was even or an odd one. Then, the second Sunday of every month was free of crime, and the pattern switched to counterclockwise on the third Wednesday of every month, then back to clockwise the next month. The only thing that actually was random was the time of day the crime happened and the type. Izuku was a little confused at this revelation of a pattern. There was no way this was natural. Someone had to be pulling the strings for it to be set up this way. And if quirkless Izuku was able to figure it out, someone else should have been able to do the same. Then he remembered that there wasn't really anyone patrolling this area, so he supposed it wasn't actually that big of a surprise. Well, if that was the case, then he would just have to take advantage of knowing where things would happen and try to stop them. And if he just so happened to figure out who was controlling the crime while he was at it, well, that would just be the icing on the cake. It had only taken a couple hours to find the pattern, which Izuku completed after his normal workout at the gym. So now he was free to do whatever until night fell. He should probably sleep. He stays up most of the night patrolling, then has to work at the cafe the next day. Realistically, he probably wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. His sleep schedule had always been fairly regular, so sleeping during the day and taking frequent naps was going to have to be something for him to get used to. He laid out a couple blankets and spread out on them. He picked up the phone. He recently ran an update on it that would allow him to do anything on his phone that he would normally do on his computer, and it would show simultaneously on the computer and vice versa. That way, if one of them breaks, he doesn't lose his work. He scrolled through it absent-mindedly. He came across an article that caused him to pause. All Might would be teaching at UA starting this year. Or actually starting tomorrow, he should say. His friends, Jiro, Tsu, Ojiro, Uraka, they would all be learning from the best of the best at the best institution in the country. An ache as old as his quirklessness pulsed in his chest. He didn't think it would ever truly go away, no matter how many villains he helped put away, or how much he helped the community. At this point, it was nearly like an old friend, something that would always be with him, a creature comfort like a security blanket. It told him that he hadn't changed, that he hadn't given up, that fate was leading him exactly where he was supposed to be going, and that calmed his mind more than he was wanting to admit. It had been a long time since Izuku had gone down an All Might rabbit hole, even longer since he went back to when it all started. He pulled up photos and stories about when All Might was in high school and just after graduation. Then he found a photo he hadn't seen before. It was in an article that was buried deep within the internet. Not in the area where light doesn't shine, but more like an area where people no longer go. Like those ghost towns lost in the forests of Japan, sun shining brightly down upon it, where it's even more beautiful because of the lack of humanity. Where Izuku is the once-in-a-decade visitor and he has all the time in the world to admire its beauty. It was an article talking about a woman mentor to All Might and her work in the community, about how she was never seen without a smile, about how she always saved more than just the physical bodies of Mustafa's citizens. She also saved their hearts. She did more than just fight villains. She also worked with villain rehabilitation programs and donated the large part of her paychecks to anti-discrimination programs and programs that helped people find jobs and afford food and find housing. Ultimately, programs that are aimed at reducing the number of villains heroes face. It also hinted at how the Hero Public Safety Commission wasn't a fan of hers, how they believed she was shirking her duties by refusing to blindly go after the villains they sent her way. That was the kind of hero Izuku wanted to be. She didn't have the strength of All Might or his persona that made her instantly likable to any civilian and authority figure alike. But Izuku could see where All Might got his smile. Izuku wanted to learn more about her. It was interesting. Just like All Might, anything before high school was simply gone. That's not completely unheard of. There are plenty of high-profile heroes who want to keep their childhoods a secret in order to protect their friends and family. But during that time, it was more common to know absolutely everything about heroes. It made the civilians feel like they were closer to the people protecting them. It made them closer to human instead of the gods that they are near considered today. He wondered, where did her beliefs stem from? Did she grow up poor, surrounded by villains, or people with villainous quirks like Uraraka? Or was she a bystander, just watching injustice pass her by, and then decided it wasn't right when she was older and wanted to make amends? He looked up her mentor. He was a man that was known for being active in his community and having a good head on his shoulders. He knew his limitations and also knew how to use his quirk and the quirks of those around him effectively. He was a master strategist during his time as a hero, at least until he was tragically killed in the line of duty, a fate that also befell his mentee. And like his mentee, his early years were a mystery. His mentor was a bald-headed man with abundant bravery and enthusiasm. He was one of the first officially recognized heroes. His name was Lariat. Although it was almost 100 years old, Izuku found a video with him laughing joyously and boldly daring some villain to come after him. He reminded Izuku of All Might. If this hero mentor thing was genetic, then Izuku would almost think All Might got it from him. Hopefully, All Might didn't also inherit his penchant for being torn in half by a villain. Lariat only ever mentioned his mentor once. He said his mentor was a quiet man, one who avoided the public and worked every day of his life to master his quirk. Evidently, his master was the one to tell him to keep his past in the past. Evidently, this was hilarious to Lariat because his master was taught by someone who cared very little about holding on to his own secrets. Unfortunately, Lariat's master died of a mysterious illness at a young age. Bruce was a man who worked with the Resistance shortly after the dawn of quirks. He and two others were the leaders. They fought against the government's, quote, death squads, unquote. People who were quirkless would go around and indiscriminately kill those who were found to have quirks. This group of 3 men worked together on a type of underground railroad to transport people who had quirks to places where they would be safe. It was even thought that one of these men was quirkless himself. It was the first modern example of someone fighting against quirk discrimination and is often used as an example in schools about not discriminating against others based on their quirk. Unfortunately, there were not many examples of villainous quirks, unquote, and, quote, mutant quirks were normally limited to extra limbs or horns. Quirks were still fairly new and hadn't had time to evolve into the complex oddities they were today. This only reinforced the thought that people with fully mutant quirks or people with quirks that are so incredibly complex that people don't truly understand them, i.e. villainous quirks, are unworthy of being considered. Not to mention the quirkless themselves. Having one quirkless person working among the quirked and for the quirked allowed the teachers to subtly insinuate that the quirkless were below the quirked. It made Izuku's life a nightmare. Over the next few years, the group lost one person after the other. The quirkless man, he was sick and weak throughout his whole life. His brother was a villain. Some say the original villain, and used anyone he could find in order to fight back against the government. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people died in his bid to take over the country. The resistance didn't agree and did what they could to stop him and transport his personnel somewhere far from him. After his brother died from his illness, it was like nothing could stop him. He tracked down anyone who worked against him and killed them with ruthless abandon. There was this rumor that the villain was searching not only for world domination, but also supposedly for a treasure that was hidden from him by his brother, the location of which was passed between the leaders of the resistance. After the death of the last leader, which so happened to be Bruce, by the villain, the trail of the treasure went cold. It was believed that the location of it died with him. Due to his single-minded ambition to take everything for himself, the villain was given the moniker All for One. All for One took this moniker and applied it to not only to himself, but to his quirk as well. He had the power to give and take quirks at will. He reportedly was able to use any quirk he took, and there didn't seem to be any limit. Izuku found this absolutely fascinating. That type of quirk, if used now, could do so much good. It could help those who were hurt by their quirks, and it could even give quirks to the quirkless in order to stop discrimination. But did Izuku even want a quirk? If he had one, even if it was weak or useless, he could have been a hero. But he was a hero now, just not in name. The leaders of the resistance, they were the first to use their quirks to fight those who were using theirs to harm others. They were heroes, even if they were not given the title. What made Izuku any different? Was it because he didn't have a quirk? Not really. One of the leaders, All for One's brother, was quirkless. He was the first and only quirkless hero. He fought against a man with the strongest recorded quirk in history, and he wasn't All Might. He wasn't nearly as strong as All Might or even as healthy, but he still fought. He may have lost his life, although not to All for One, but he was able to keep his treasure from him. He made a difference. If All for One had gotten that treasure, he probably would have been able to take over the world with no problems. His quirkless brother made it impossible for him to do that. All for One died, not even ruling a single city. Wait, did he die? Well, that's a stupid question, because of course he did. But when? He killed his brother, Bruce, and the one other person who knew where the treasure was, but what happened after that? Izuku found it difficult to believe he just gave up. No, someone had to have been given the location. Izuku's mind instantly went to Lariat's unnamed master, the only other person with a confirmed link to Bruce. The hermit avoided the public and was able to keep the treasure hidden. That's why the information Izuku found made it sound as if the location died with Bruce. It's because Hermit Man made it that way purposefully. If the person who knew the location of the treasure was known and in the public's eye, it would be easier for All for One to find them. Lariat's master hid himself away to give the illusion that the treasure was lost. But he would have had to give it to someone else after him. If he died so young, he would have had to know he was sick. So he would have looked for a successor. That person had to be Lariat. And based on Lariat's comment that the past remain in the past, and knowing that All for One killed anyone he wanted to in his quest for power, The hermit probably told Lariat that himself and any other successors would need to keep their friends and family a secret or risk them being killed or tortured. And if this pattern continued until it reached All Might's mentor, Nana Shimura, she was the first to publicize her family, her husband and son. Izuku then found an article about her husband being killed by a villain. Izuku had a gut feeling it wasn't some random villain. The treasure is only passed down to one person each generation. It's not logical to believe that the treasure had nothing to do with her husband's death, but that would mean that All for One was still around. But if he was still around, he would have to be over 150 years old. There has not been any recorded instance of a human living that long without a longevity quirk. But he could steal quirks. What if he found one? Is he making too much of a leap in logic? Well, even if the theory is improbable, it certainly isn't impossible. And if he really is that old, then why does he need money? He would have had plenty of time to collect enough money to bribe or buy out absolutely any person or company he would want. It clicked. It's not money. Not by a long shot. It's a quirk. Izuku's heart rate skyrocketed. He popped up and sat cross-legged on the blankets. His legs shook up and down. The treasure was a quirk. Then Izuku stilled. It wasn't just any quirk. The treasure was All Might's quirk. He guessed maybe Lariat's laughter was genetic after all. End of chapter.